talking about the Missile Technology Control Regime, which is the MTCR for short. The problem we've got is that, as it says here, launch vehicles are very difficult to be separated from actual weapons. So ballistic missiles, for instance. The definition that's used in MTCR is anything that can deliver a payload of 500 kilograms to 300 kilometers is considered a missile and falls under the MTCR rules. So think of anything that you want to put in orbit. That vehicle is going to have the capability of obviously flying greater than 300 kilometers and will probably be lifting more than 500 kilograms or have the capability of lifting more than 500 kilograms. And that's a key point. It doesn't have to be lifting more than 500 kilograms. It just has the capability of doing that. So the MTCR is broken down into two categories. The first one is more launch oriented, and that's the complete delivery systems or equipment that are built into complete delivery systems. So rocket engines, the entire vehicle would all be considered category 1. And category 1 really identifies what the, it really puts great restrictions on what you can use and what you can do. Category 2, on the other hand, has a number of different items that are within the category 2, and you have more flexibility with this, but you're still under MTCR regulations. So if you wanted to build and put a computer from the States that is capable of going into a ballistic missile, or is even hardened to go into a ballistic missile, then it's considered under MTCR Cat 2. So you can see this list is very long, and it can encompass an awful lot of equipment that individuals, Canadians, may want to build into their satellites, their launch vehicles, may want to use it for something completely different than and outside of these capabilities. But the very fact that they live in the category 2 then says how that equipment can get used. So let's take a look at Brazil. They were one of the ones that have a TSA agreement. And why does Brazil want to be part of the space industry? What are their goals? Well, basically, and this is directly out of a press release from Brazil, Brazil wants to get a piece of the $300 billion a year space industry, and specifically the launch business. They're trying to build out or resurrect a site in the northeast part of Brazil, Alcântara. It was used for their space industry, and now they're trying to convert that into a commercial site. So they're trying to get into this space industry, into this space race, and they see a TSA as being a big part of that. The United Kingdom, they're a little bit more expressive in what they're trying to accomplish. So basically, again, it's all about growth. They see economic benefits directly to their country coming from the space industry. So they want, as it says here, they want part of the space sector, and they want 10% of that by 2030. Huge goals. They want to deliver commercial benefit to the UK. And then they're going to follow up with all the regulatory responsibilities and the technology pieces. All of the countries that have signed a TSA are also part of the MTCR, which its goal is to prevent proliferation of the technology to rogue countries, essentially. So within this entire framework is the concept that we're trying to stop technology from going to rogue countries. When the TSA with the UK and the United States was signed, Karen Pierce, who was the UK ambassador, basically said, this marks an exciting new area for space collaboration. This agreement will generate further growth and prosperity for both our countries. The UK's already awarded 40 million pounds to establish various spaceports. And then the spaceports are trickling down into other elements of the economy as well. So this isn't just about launch. It seems to be, everything tends to lean towards launch, but it's always about the spin-offs that the launch generates and the commercial capabilities. But at the heart of a TSA is the desire, the need to grow commercially in each of the countries that have signed the TSA. New Zealand's, what are their goals? Well, Rocket Lab's the obvious spin-off of the TSA. New Zealand was the first to sign a TSA of the three that I'm talking about with the United States. And so Rocket Lab was able to develop and continue to expand its operations in New Zealand. So need I say any more? The spin-offs have been incredibly obvious in the New Zealand economy. They are now as from a launch capability, New Zealand is in the forefront and will continue to be because they've got literally about a 2-year, maybe 3-year head start on the whole concept of being a launch country. So what is the structure of a TSA? And what we'll find as we go through this comparative analysis is that it's very similar because it's driven by the United States. So they will try to negotiate these TSAs in pretty much the same way with every country that they're involved in. So there are 10 articles, you see them here, and they again are focused on the launch capability, but remember that everything that happens with launch has its spin-offs into other capabilities. So if you're building a satellite and you want to put it on top of a vehicle, then you still fall under the TSA agreements, say in the UK. So Article 1, basically it says just the motherhood and apple pie statement wants to preclude unauthorized access to or transfer of US original technologies. So again, the focus is on the technologies coming out of the States and they're trying to control that as it goes through. What legal document would be the same without a definition section? There's two key ones that I want to talk about as far as segregation of equipment. And that's the segregated or restricted area and the controlled area. Only US participants are allowed into the segregated or restricted area. So when the technology that is using American technology, a satellite, a launch vehicle, anything that has US restricted equipment in it must go to the segregated area. And it's only US participants that are then allowed to work in that segregated area. National participants, UK, New Zealand, Brazil, can go into the controlled areas, but again, that's more for the working with everything around and not on the US protected equipment. Here's a really important definition. This is why I say that a TSA is really important for Canada to start working with the United States on ratifying or even agreeing to. A foreign spacecraft means any payloads, spacecraft, et cetera, spacecraft components, including satellites, groups of satellites, subsystems, and satellite components. Now, this happened to be quoted from the New Zealand document. So it's imported into New Zealand from a country other than the United States, so Canada, for instance, and used to conduct launch activities. So again, if Canada were to develop a satellite that uses any US technology that would fall under MTCR or under the TSA agreements, we would be considered a foreign spacecraft and would fall under these TSA regulations for New Zealand or for Brazil or the United Kingdom. So again, it's not just about launch. This encompasses an incredible amount of the space technology that we want to work on as Canadians. Let's take a look at some of the different provisions. Now, there is an awful lot of information that I've been able to pull together here. Hussein has agreed that we will distribute this presentation in its entirety to anybody who wants it. And so Hussein will go over the details of how to pull that down later. But the fact of the matter is there's a lot of information here. I'm only going to highlight the key differences between the agreements there. But I also want to emphasize right at the beginning, before we go too deeply into this, that there are an incredible number of similarities, and even the differences are relatively small. So creating a template for an agreement with the United States by Canada, for instance, is relatively easy. So in the first case, general provisions, New Zealand says they're not going to use, they're not going to develop or acquire any technology at the MTCR Cat 1. Britain, on the other side, said that they won't use funds from the launches to develop their own rocket or unmanned systems. Brazil sits somewhere in between, and they're saying that they won't use funds to develop any MTCR Category 1 systems. So slightly different meaning, or slightly different wording, but completely different meaning. So you can imagine in Britain, you're not going to use any funds from the launches to develop rockets or unmanned. It's completely restricted. Now, that doesn't stop them from doing that, but they just can't use the funds that were used in the launch process. So you can see that there's a number of line items that are completely generic across all of them. US intends to approve export license. The national government intends to approve export licenses. It's interesting, though, in the case of New Zealand and the UK, each of them intend to approve the launch. Brazil says nothing about whether it intends to do the launch or not, or to agree to it. And then the launch control and custody arrangements are specific to the other agreements. Brazil somehow got away without those clauses. When it comes to control of the US launch vehicles, spacecraft, related equipment, and technical data, again, that was exactly what I talked about before. Basically, it's completely consistent across all of the agreements that are studied here. So US participants have access to the segregated and control areas, as I mentioned. All persons must adhere to this agreement. The government ensures continuity of licenses, and the government must notify the US of suspended or revoked licenses. So very key again is that the US, it's a very US-centric agreement, and it's all about what their technology is going to go into and how it's going to be used. Disclosure and use. So any US participants can't release any technical details to anybody else. It says national participants in the agreement, but the implication is also nobody else. You can't retransfer the technology. So I can't take a satellite that I've built with US technology into the UK and then have it launched for the Ukraine. None of that is allowed. And in Brazil, it gets a little, they get a little more specific. They don't want any US launch vehicles on their territory that contain any harmful substances, particularly radioactive materials. And they go one step further, which is really interesting that none of the other, or neither of the others requested it. The US is capable of launching into any orbital parameter and function for the vehicle in the UK and New Zealand, whereas Brazil has specifically said, we want to know where it's going and what it's doing. I found that really interesting that Brazil, of all countries, would be able to get away with it. And congratulations to them, so that they can actually understand what their national assets are being used for. They also went one step further, and they said that they would safeguard military information, whereas the other two removed the word military, and now all information in those two countries are under classification. Again, you can see that there's pretty good consistency in the access controls. So who gets to go where? In Britain's case, the UK authorities have access to the segregated areas under certain restrictions. Brazil, I found really interesting, specifically called out the fact that police and firefighters can get into the segregated areas to perform their duties. In other words, if there's a fire in the segregated area was being fueled, and suddenly there's a fire in the on the launch pad. Britain and New Zealand technically just have to stand back and watch it. At least Brazil said the firefighters can go in and fight the blaze. Again, processing procedures. How does the actual vehicle and the equipment on the vehicle get handled? And there are lots of details around there. Again, sealed packages arrive, and who gets to open it, who doesn't. Basically consistent across all of the various countries. One key distinction, though, again, Brazil says that it will use all procedures following a normal launch, whereas the other two countries talk about post-launch procedures and have more details into those post-launch procedures than Brazil does. All of the Article 8 are shared by the three countries, and so they all talk about how they're going to handle launch delay, launch cancellation, anomalies, and failures, so that US equipment, again, is protected after these conditions occur. The next three sections, 9 and 10, well, next two sections, I guess, are completely the same across all of them. Implementation, once it's signed and ratified by the various parties, Parliament in the UK, Brazilian government, once those are satisfied, then the agreement comes into effect, and disputes are resolved through normal diplomatic channels. In the last case, it just basically talks about that it can be amended and or terminated, but it just has to be done in writing with each of the country, by each of the countries, or by one of the countries in the case of termination. But it takes 1 year to get out from underneath the entire agreement. Where's Canada on this? We don't have a TSA. I've talked to people in States and people here in Canada in the know, and they say that initial work has been done, but it's been some time since that work took place, and there's been no real emphasis on it recently at all. So Canada, what do we really, why do we need to be part of this? What we're talking about is Canada and Canadian companies want to be part of the new space race. We heard just recently Transport Canada state that Canada does want to be a launch nation. And to be a launch nation, we have to be part of the TSA if we're going to use any technology that comes out of the United States, which is very likely. I mean, the United States has such great technology. They've had a head start on it by decades. And so they've got a lot of technology that we can incorporate with our own new technology, and we can enter into that new space race. Canadian companies want to leverage US technology, so they want to be able to build satellites with components from the United States. So we need to be part of a Canadian, there needs to be a Canadian Safe Technology Services Safeguards Agreement with the US. And as I mentioned, as you noticed in the comparative study, there's a lot more that's consistent across each of the jurisdictions that I've looked at. And so that means that we can create basically a template from those agreements that we could take then now to the US and get relatively quick turnaround on the TSA. So what's next? Well, we need to get Canada on board with the Canadian government on board with this concept. And so that means we need to start bringing this up with the Canadian government at various levels and talking with them about the need for a technology safeguard agreement with the United States. And so I'm suggesting that we try to form a consistent voice. We start here. And if anybody's interested, I will be lobbying over the next while various aspects of the Canadian government to get a TSA in place, because it's important for my business. But most importantly, it's good for Canadian businesses who want to be in the space sector. And so this isn't about C6 launch. This is about what Canada needs to do in order to become and join that new space race. So send an email off to me. There's the email. Please put TSA and only TSA in the subject line so that we can, I can sort through that, and then I'll determine what the next steps are as a collective. So I've got a few minutes left. I'm amazed that I got through all of that in the time that we had, but I noticed there are some elements in the chat session. So let me see if I can bring that up on this side.
Yes, Richard, great presentation. I think people are very, very interested in learning more and obviously sharing more. Kevin in the chat section is asking, how would a Canadian TSA apply to companies that do not build them in Canada? They buy them from a foreign manufacturer, and this typically happens in satellite and SATCOM industry.
Well, if you're using any U.S. technology, then you would have to, we would have to have a TSA in place to fall under that regime. Because without the TSA, it's very difficult to bring any of that U.S. technology into Canada because there's no framework for it. If we buy components strictly from foreign sources, a lot of those countries have also signed on to the TSAs, but they've also signed on to the MTCR, and the MTCR has restrictions on some of that equipment as well. So for instance, if you were to get if someone were to buy equipment from Canada to take outside of this country, then because Canada was actually one of the founding signatories to the MTCR, we would also fall under those same rules. So the TSA gives us a framework on which to build with this equipment under the MTCR rules and put it onto a launch. So for instance, if we wanted to launch here in Canada, as Transport Canada said, we want to be a launch nation, then all that equipment would be falling under MTCR and TSA agreements.
Excellent. And I've got one more question because of the time that we have here. Who does TSA benefit most? ITAR led to quote unquote ITAR free? Does the rest of the world need TSA as much today?
Well, the simple answer, who does it benefit the most, is the United States, because it encourages people to use their technology, and it also encourages people the US to be involved in any launch that their equipment is involved in. So the real beneficiary is the United States. But beyond that, within the TSA regimes, as I say, the TSA is targeted towards the launch, the spaceports themselves. But because of all the spin-offs from it, it's difficult to say who ultimately would be the beneficiaries of that. In my own case, we've been talking with Shetland and others, and we've been looking at US technology as well as others. And so from our perspective, because the equipment that we're looking at would fall under MTCR and therefore under TSAs, it makes it easier for us to go to countries that have TSAs in place. And so
Absolutely.
It benefits us as a country that wants to use US technology, and it is actually an enabling device for people to go to various launch sites. So if we really want to be a launch nation and have other countries come to us, then we need to be able to get a TSA in place.